10月27号是小土豆发表碳税妥协之后的第一天。这一天的众议会就此问题进行了激烈的辩论，各党派的议题如下：保守党碳税政策批评，保守党议员批评政府的碳税政策，认为这会对加拿大人的生活产生重大影响。这是一个在政治中备受争议的问题。政府的行动和政策转变，保守党议员质疑政府的行动和政策转变，强调一致性的问题。这关乎政府的可信度和决策的连贯性。食品价格影响，保守党议员关注碳税对食品价格的影响，表达对居民的担忧。食品价格问题对加拿大人的生活质量具有重要影响。自由党减少碳排放和气候政策，自由党议员强调政府在减少碳排放和应对气候变化方面的努力，这被认为是一个重要的政府议程，涉及全球气候变化问题。社会支持措施，自由党议员提到了加拿大儿童福利金和社区组织支持，强调政府的社会支持措施，这对于社会公平和福利至关重要。后面请欣赏10月27号的众议院辩论。
With plummeting polls in Atlantic Canada, this Prime Minister is panicked, desperate, and making it up as he goes along. Only a year ago, Liberal MPs voted against a Conservative motion to axe a carbon tax from home heating. What a difference a year makes. I know my farmers in Alberta are sure wondering what it takes for them to get some relief from this Prime Minister's carbon tax. But yesterday, the Prime Minister admitted that his carbon tax is unaffordable. So how much worse do the polls have to get for the Prime Minister to axe his carbon tax for all Canadians?
Hear, hear. L'honorable ministre de l'Environnement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we came into power in 2015, projected emissions growth in Canada, so pollution levels was going to increase to 80 million tons by 2030. We brought this down 80 million tons, more than 80 million tons, in fact, and since then, we've reduced it by another 50 million tons, Mr. Speaker. So that's more than 100 million tons of pollutions that Canada won't have to endure because of us, despite the Conservative Party of Canada. We're only getting started, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan to fight climate change and to help Canadians with affordability. We'll keep going at it.
L'honorable député de Foothills.
While the Prime Minister presses pause on his carbon tax in Atlantic Canada, the Liberals are blocking a Conservative bill that will exempt the carbon tax from on-farm fuels, making food more affordable. I guess the desperate pleas of Canadian farmers don't have the same weight as the Prime Minister's plummeting polls in Atlantic Canada. But let's be clear. Putting a pause is only a move of desperation for this Prime Minister, who will double down, as this Minister just said, on his pledge to quadruple the carbon tax. Again, the Prime Minister's admitted his carbon tax is unaffordable. When will he axe his carbon tax for all Canadians?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, as my father used to say, when you point the fingers, there's always three fingers pointing back at you. When it came time to decrease funding to farmers, the Leader of the official opposition sat on his hand at the cabinet table. When it came time to increase funding to farmers, all Conservatives MPs sat on their hands. And on C-234, if it was so important for the Leader of the official opposition, he should have sat on his hand and worked a little harder.
L'honorable député de Foothill.
The Liberals don't care about food costs or affordability. Canadians are struggling to put food on the table after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government. Almost 2 million Canadians accessed a food bank in March. That's up 79% from March of 2019. A third of those people using food banks are children, and almost 20% of Canadian families are food insecure. A Prime Minister who is in desperation mode is not worth the cost. Again, the Prime Minister has admitted his carbon tax is unaffordable. When will he axe that tax for all Canadians so they can afford to put food on the table?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, we know that right now many Canadian families are struggling with increased costs. Last night I was speaking with Faye, and Faye shared with me that he came to Canada with his family 5 years ago from Syria. And he shared the impact that the Canada Child Benefit had on his family, enabled them to ensure that they could buy food and the things that their children needed. This is one story, Mr. Speaker, of the 3.5 million Canadian families that receive this benefit each and every month.
L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, 800,000 Quebecers are resorting to food banks every month. That's one Quebecer in 10. 30% more in 1 year, 73% more than in 2019. And what's worse, 70% of food banks are running short of food. And the Liberals want to hike the carbon tax, which will increase the cost of everything. When will the Prime Minister scrap the second carbon tax of 20 cents a litre that he's imposed on all Quebecers?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. And it's clear, Mr. Speaker, we are in the heat of the action. We're stabilizing grocery prices for Canadians. There's the Canada Child Benefit, which continues to put money in the pockets of Canadians and Quebecers. Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax doesn't apply in Quebec, and the member knows that full well. Mr. Speaker, we are here to support Quebecers and Canadians, and we will continue getting the job done. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Well, they're missing in action because yesterday in a newspaper article it said that over 800,000 Quebecers are resorting to food banks. It's a national embarrassment. That's the legacy of 8 years of Liberal government. And further on it says the face of poverty is changing. Workers, women, students, university students are all resorting to food banks. The Liberals are plummeting in the polls. Will the Prime Minister scrap the second carbon tax that he's imposed on all Quebecers, yes or no?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, once again, on this side of the House, we recognize that many Canadian families are facing challenges. Just last week, I had the opportunity to visit the Eden Food for Change in the riding of Mississauga Erin Mills. And that institution, that organization, helps to feed individuals each and every day. Through the Community Services Recovery Fund, we've put $400 million into these community organizations to help address these problems.
Mark is a local grocery store owner in Dawson City. Mark has seen his already high shipping costs get slapped with a 94% fuel surcharge because of this Prime Minister's carbon tax. A dozen eggs is $8. A pound of butter is $9. And get this, a kilogram of cheese is $30. Yukoners know they simply can't afford this Prime Minister any longer. Will this NDP Liberal government finally stop punishing Yukoners and axe their carbon tax?
L'honorable ministre de l'Environnement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canada Energy Regulator estimates that wind power will provide about 30% of total Canada's supply in 2050, compared to less than 6% in 2021. Now, according to a recent study by the Public Policy Forum, offshore wind could be for Atlantic Canada what, and I quote, oil was for Texas or hydropower for Quebec. This is transformational for Atlantic Canada. I think a lot of Canadians, Mr. Speaker, are wondering why is the Conservative Party opposing the development of clean, renewable energy for Atlantic Canadians and, in fact, for all Canadians, Mr. Speaker?
To the question, Minister.
L'honorable député de Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite this Prime Minister's fancy photo ops yesterday, Yukoners are facing a cold winter where they have to decide between keeping their kids warm or keeping them fed. Carbon tax is causing transportation costs to double and food prices to skyrocket. Instead of making it better for struggling Yukoners, this NDP Liberal government is making it worse. After 8 years, this Prime Minister simply isn't worth the cost. Yukoners want to know, will they end in its entirety the carbon tax? When?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, I respect the honourable member across the way speaking for the people of Yukon. We have a fantastic member of Parliament on this side that actually represents the Yukon. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that the investments that we are making in that territory are transformational investments in our tourism industry, in making sure that we have climate resiliency. Mr. Speaker, what the Conservatives have against climate change is the fact that they don't believe in it. They ran on a policy to actually fight climate change. Now they're under new management. They don't care. We're due. We're going to fight climate change for Yukoners and all Canadians.
Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago, the Liberal MPs voted to keep the carbon tax on home heating. Yesterday, the Prime Minister flip-flopped. Why? Polling numbers. Yesterday's announcement of the pause on the carbon tax on home heating won't help 97% of Canadians. Canadians can see this for what it is. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. The common sense Conservative promise is simple. No gimmicks, no temporary measures. Will the panicking, plummeting Prime Minister admit he cares more about polls than Canadians, and will he now axe the entire carbon tax?
L'honorable Ministre.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his questions. But look, he ran on a plan to actually fight climate change and then threw it out the window when they got a new chief executive officer for their party. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, all they want to do is take us back to a time when polluters could actually pollute for free. And Mr. Speaker, our plan is going to allow Atlantic Canadians to shift from a high GHG fuel to a solution that is actually going to lower GHGs in perpetuity. That means for the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, forever. We're going to keep fighting climate change. They can keep complaining that we're actually doing the right thing on behalf of Canadians.
Where was the minister last year? Because on October 24th, 2022, we voted on a motion here which the Conservatives proposed to scrap the carbon tax on home heating. And just yesterday, the Liberals flip-flopped and suddenly said they supported that idea. Mr. Speaker, the fact is, if people in the Atlantic region are going to get a break, what about Quebecers? What about Montrealers? Are they going to give them a tax too, a break too, and scrap the carbon tax? The Honourable Minister. It's true, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to follow all the information about climate change, and I can understand why my friend opposite is a bit confused. So the clean fuel standard applies all across Canada. It applied yesterday, it applies today, it applies in Atlantic Canada, in Quebec, Alberta, or even BC. It's completely different from the carbon tax. And the investments are creating hundreds of jobs, including among farmers who are going to produce canola and so on. But if the Conservatives took office, all of that would disappear.